Mike Danton had the entire world in the palm of his hand. At just 23 years of age, he was lacing up under the blazing lights of the National Hockey League, absolutely living out the ultimate childhood dream. Then, completely out of nowhere, he actively plotted a murder for hire, and unluckily for him, the so-called assassin he recruited turned out to be an undercover law enforcement officer equipped with a hidden microphone. That single catastrophic choice landed him a crushing sentence, 7.5 years locked away inside a federal penitentiary. But here's the twist. The intended victim was far from a random target. It was the exact same shadowy figure who had meticulously manipulated every single aspect of his existence since he was just 11 years old. Going to trial is completely off the table, do you understand me? If we let this see the inside of a courtroom, your entire career and your life are absolutely finished. But before we dive in, if you are new here and you love the wildest, most unbelievable stories in sports history, hit that like button right now and subscribe so you never miss a single drop. Alright, let us rewind to the spring of 2004, a period when this promising young athlete is standing right on the precipice of making a monumentally terrible life-altering choice. He is a fresh-faced 23-year-old skater suiting up for the St. Louis Blues, completely immersed in the chaotic high-stakes pressure cooker of the Stanley Cup playoffs. But while his teammates are battling it out on the ice in San Jose, desperately trying to keep their postseason hopes alive, this young forward is secluded away, making some incredibly frantic and desperate telephone calls. He casually asks a romantic interest he had been seeing whether she happens to know a tough guy, willing to cross any moral line, for a cool $10,000 in cash. Unwittingly sealing his fate, she passes the receiver to the man sitting directly beside her in the car, a moonlighting police dispatcher going by the name of Justin Jones. The desperate athlete starts spinning a frantic web, claiming that some very dangerous individuals are currently hunting him down to collect on an unpaid debt, and he urgently needs to hire someone to preemptively take out the primary threat. He is going to be hanging around the local area. I just need you to be completely aware that the target will definitely be at the location sometime between 9 and 12 o'clock. So keeping that specific window in mind, that is absolutely going to be your prime opportunity to get the job done. Instead of slamming the receiver down, the dispatcher decides to play along with the twisted narrative, accepts the gruesome contract, and then immediately contacts the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Federal agents waste absolutely no time strapping the informant with recording equipment alongside a completely unloaded prop firearm, before dispatching him directly to the target's upscale apartment complex in St. Louis. When the fake hitman finally rings the intercom, the guy who steps out onto the terrace is definitely not the hockey star. Remember, the desperate player is still thousands of miles away, traveling with his squad. The mysterious figure casually lounging at the residence is none other than David Frost, the highly controversial sports representative who managed the young star's entire career. He was the player's former youth league mentor, and shockingly, the very man marked for death. Fast forward just 48 hours, and federal authorities slap handcuffs on the young hockey player at the San Jose transportation hub, hitting him with heavily weighted charges of conspiracy to commit a premeditated assassination. When the gavel finally fell at the sentencing hearing, the presiding magistrate would famously declare for the official record, "I seriously doubt that in my 18+ years serving on this judicial bench, I have ever encountered a criminal proceeding quite as remarkably twisted and surreal as this specific ordeal." And honestly, the magistrate was completely spot on. Because the actual mystery here was never really about the mechanics of the botched assassination itself. The hit was incredibly amateurish, full of glaring holes, and undeniably destined to fail spectacularly right out of the gate. The true, deeply unsettling enigma that kept everyone up at night was this: what terrifying underlying circumstances could possibly push a highly paid 23-year-old elite athlete to plunge into such a dark abyss of utter desperation? The general public instantly jumped to the conclusion that it revolved around massive gambling debts. But every single one of those armchair detectives was completely missing the mark by a country mile. The genuine, horrifying narrative actually kicks off 13 years prior, tracing all the way back to the fateful moment a vulnerable 10-year-old kid crossed paths with the dominant authority figure who would aggressively consume his entire world. You see, this controlling mastermind did not actually begin his career negotiating million-dollar professional sports contracts. He originally cut his teeth as a low-level youth league instructor up in Toronto back during an era when the young skater was still proudly answering to his given birth name. Mike Jefferson. The aggressive youth mentor initially made his pitch to the boys' mother and father, Steve and Sue Jefferson, way back in the year 1991. He enthusiastically scouted their highly talented child to join the ranks of an elite developmental squad known locally as the Toronto Young Nationals. The promising prospect was barely 10 years of age at the time. The hyper-intense coach was only in his early 20s himself, operating a fiercely competitive training academy stationed in Brampton, Ontario. He pushed juvenile athletes with an utterly terrifying level of hardcore intensity that raised serious eyebrows, even within the infamously brutal culture of the ice rink. He would obsessively dissect and analyze grainy game footage with these elementary school-age kids exactly as if they were seasoned veterans of the major leagues, all while looking the parents dead in the eye and swearing he possessed the magic formula to catapult their boys straight to the big show. Like many hopeful hockey dads, Steve Jefferson completely bought into the intoxicating fantasy being sold to him. The father would later look back on watching his son's very first time hitting the ice under the new mentor's extreme system, recalling how he was absolutely blown away by the kid's sudden explosive development during gameplay. However, the manipulative coach's toxic grip extended far beyond the freezing confines of the local skating rink. One of the absolute earliest psychological mandates he hammered into the heads of his young roster was chillingly straightforward. He demanded they never discuss the sport with their own mothers and fathers, arrogantly claiming that parents were completely ignorant and lacked the mental capacity to comprehend the nuances of the game. By the time the easily influenced teenager blew out the candles on his 15th birthday, the once loving bond connecting him to his biological family had completely eroded into a pile of unfixable rubble. In a bizarre twist, he packed his bags and moved directly into a household shared by the coach and the coach's wife, effectively making the emotional canyon between the boy and his real parents absolutely irreversible. When he finally reached 21 years of age, the deeply brainwashed athlete filed the official legal paperwork to permanently alter his identity to Michael Sage Danton. He bizarrely took the surname of a random 13-year-old kid he had previously encountered at one of those grueling summer training camps simply because he was convinced the new name gave off a much tougher vibe. He made it absolutely clear to anyone who would listen there was no universe where he would ever skate on an NHL rink wearing a jersey with the name Jefferson stitched across the shoulders. The young athlete ruthlessly severed every single tie with his roots, completely shutting out his mom and dad, his little brother Tom, and pretty much anyone else who shared his bloodline. Whenever he actually had to bring up the people who raised him, he stripped them of their parental titles, entirely coldly referring to them just by their first names, Steve and Sue. And he did not hesitate to declare to the media that those people were absolutely nothing to him, effectively erasing them from his own life story. While all of this family drama was unfolding, David Frost somehow managed to hustle his way into becoming a fully certified National Hockey League Players Association agent back in 2002. Which is completely mind-blowing when you consider the guy had already been permanently blacklisted from a prominent amateur hockey circuit after getting caught red-handed falsifying official documents, not to mention the fact that he had actually entered a guilty plea for physically attacking a kid on his own roster. Fast forward back to 1997 when this guy officially locked in his role as Mike's primary representative. Suddenly, the deeply unsettling manipulation that had begun at the local rink started poisoning every single private aspect of the young skater's daily existence. We are talking about a guy making serious major league bank, pulling down massive paychecks while lacing up for the New Jersey Devils, and later the St. Louis Blues. However, it was the puppet master Frost who held absolute power over the purse strings, dictating exactly how and where every single dime was spent. There was even an incredibly brazen incident where Frost got caught swiping his client's personal credit card just to fill up his tank at some random gas station out in Ontario. Yet when the law got involved, the brainwashed player actually stood up in a courtroom and aggressively defended the guy, insisting he had given him blanket permission to use his funds. The truly terrifying part is that this psychological grip extended way beyond just one guy. This predator had built an entire systematic machine, and Mike was simply a single cog turning inside of it. It turns out our guy was far from the only twisted experiment in the agent's portfolio, and he definitely was not the first victim drawn into the web. There was an entire clique of impressionable kids who followed this manipulator all the way from the youth circuits right up into the junior leagues, earning themselves the notorious nickname, the Brampton Boys, throughout the province. Running right alongside our troubled protagonists inside this heavily insulated inner circle The main crew featured a handful of other highly touted prospects, including Sheldon Keefe, a guy who would eventually rise to the rank of a top-tier NHL head coach, along with 3 other loyal followers. Every single one of these athletes displayed the exact same disturbing psychological red flags, acting incredibly withdrawn around their actual teammates and proving completely paralyzed to make even the smallest decision without getting the green light from their boss. During his stint playing up in Barrie, the rest of the squad would routinely walk into the dressing room and discover him sitting there totally decked out in his full game day gear, with a cell phone absolutely glued to the side of his head, with furiously downloading last-minute marching orders from his overlord literally seconds before it was time to hit the ice. The vibe got so toxic that the rest of the locker room branded him and the other brainwashed guys as absolute cancers to the team culture. And that harsh label had absolutely nothing to do with their skills or their grit on the ice, but rather the fact that they were basically empty shells, who lacked the basic human capacity for independent thought. Yet out of all those trapped kids, the one who suffered the deepest mental hijacking was undoubtedly Mike. He was the one who was never quite able to snap the invisible leash, and then during the sweltering summer of the year 2000, a deeply disturbing event went down that absolutely should have locked his abuser away for good. At the time, his little brother Tom was just a vulnerable kid, barely 13 years of age. The teenager had taken a trip up to the agent's secluded cabin for what was supposed to be a fun, harmless weekend getaway hanging out with the older junior league guys. But when the boy finally returned home, he was completely transformed, acting incredibly dark and totally shut down emotionally once his mother and father eventually managed to uncover a batch of disposable camera shots from that supposed vacation. They discovered a nightmare. One of the pictures literally captured the supposed mentor leveling a loaded long gun directly at their young son. An even more horrifying image showed the helpless kid securely fastened to a mattress, completely immobilized by layers of industrial duct tape. Naturally, those deeply incriminating photographs were immediately handed straight over to local law enforcement. The cops quickly launched a formal criminal inquiry into the disturbing cabin incident. Incredibly, the accused ringleader, backed up by 5 fully indoctrinated witnesses, simply brushed the whole thing off as a harmless prank, actually claiming the tied-up kid had asked for it. That led the authorities to abruptly slam the file shut. The most tragic part, the older brother stared right at those horrific pictures, fully grasping the absolute monster he was dealing with, yet the psychological chains were so thick, he still could not walk away. That right there shows you the terrifying extent of the brainwashing. It wasn't until August of 2006, a full 2 years after his star client was finally put in handcuffs, that the Ontario Provincial Police finally gathered enough to slap the disgraced agent with 12 separate counts of serious exploitation charges. Unbelievably, the magistrate presiding over the courtroom drama ended up letting the guy walk, stating on the record that the testimonies from the victims seemed way too rehearsed and potentially coordinated behind the scenes. However, even as the gavel dropped to deliver that totally gut-wrenching not guilty verdict, the magistrate made a point to publicly state that the trial had successfully ripped the curtain back on an incredibly sinister, deeply rotten underbelly of the amateur sports world, a toxic culture that was completely repulsive to normal society and demanded to be called out for exactly what it was. Yet despite all the undeniable red flags and ruined lives, the architect of this misery casually strolled right out the courthouse doors without a single restriction on his liberty. Meanwhile, his heavily manipulated protege had already been rotting away inside a maximum security federal penitentiary for more than 2 straight years. And when you look at the stark contrast, one guy locked in a cage, the other walking free, you have to ask yourself, wasn't the guy behind those iron bars essentially a hostage, long before he ever wore a prison jumpsuit? The events that unfolded during the official legal proceedings finally shined a harsh spotlight on the staggering amount of psychological trauma he had endured, because on the 16th of July, in the year 2004, just 3 chaotic months after being taken into federal custody, the broken athlete stood up in an East St. Louis courtroom directly in front of United States District Judge William Steele, swallowing his pride to enter a guilty plea for a single heavy charge of conspiracy to commit a major federal offense. The gavel finally came down, and the agreed upon sentence was a crushing 7.5 years locked away inside a federal penitentiary. That is exactly 90 months of hard time, with absolutely zero possibility of early parole under the strict unforgiving rules of the American justice system. Meanwhile, the other major player in this twisted saga, Kitty Wolfmere, headed to her own separate trial later that same September. It only took a federal jury a shocking 3 hours of deliberation to completely acquit her of all charges, largely because Danton firmly refused to take the stand to testify against her. The presiding judge had officially ruled that he was not legally required to speak up. But honestly, the most mind-blowing part of this whole situation was not some boring legal technicality. The truly insane part was the undeniable fact that even after officially entering a guilty plea and throwing his entire professional hockey career completely down the drain, and even while staring down the barrel of nearly a full decade behind bars, Mike Danton refused to utter a single negative word against his former agent David Frost in any courtroom setting. Flashback to just 1 week after the authorities slapped the cuffs on him, Danton actually made a fully recorded phone call straight from his holding cell, directly to Frost. The investigative journalism program, The Fifth Estate, eventually managed to get their hands on the official transcripts of that specific conversation, along with dozens of other highly disturbing calls between the two men. When you actually sit down and listen to these chilling jailhouse recordings, you can clearly hear Frost actively coaching Danton on exactly what he needed to say to his defense lawyers and prison counselors, essentially puppet mastering the entire narrative from the outside world. At the very end of one particularly disturbing phone call, Frost aggressively demanded that his former client say the words "I love you" before he would allow him to hang up the receiver. And incredibly, Danton actually said it. Frost pushed him even further, asking if he really wanted him, demanding he say the words out loud, pressing to see if the psychological control was still there. Danton meekly agreed and said his goodbyes. Just take a second to really sit back and think about the sheer gravity of that interaction. This guy is sitting rotting in a cold jail cell, staring down 7 miserable years of his life, totally gone, and he is still desperately performing like a trained SEAL for the exact same man who destroyed his life. Even from behind thick steel bars and concrete walls, David Frost completely owned his mind, and let us be absolutely clear, that is not a story of loyalty. That is straight up psychological manipulation. It is basically Stockholm Syndrome wrapped up tight in hockey tape. Following the trial, Danton was shipped off to the Federal Correctional Institute located in Sandstone, Minnesota, which would serve as his absolute rock bottom home for the next 5 excruciatingly long years of his life. However, once he was fully locked inside the system, something deep within his psyche finally started to shift in a genuinely positive direction. He actively began working alongside a dedicated clinical psychiatrist and a prison psychologist, 2 professionals who finally helped him deeply unpack his troubled childhood and properly examine the brainwashing dynamics of his long relationship with Frost. Looking back on those intense therapy sessions, the former enforcer later described his mental breakthrough in incredibly raw, straightforward terms. He explained that the psychiatrist basically tore down his old mental walls and helped him get completely in touch with an entirely new, healthier way of processing the world around him. Before prison, he admitted he had been living like a live wire, extremely impulsive, hot-headed, and a guy who barely ever gave a second thought to the real-world repercussions of his actions. He described the overall transformation in his core personality as nothing short of incredible, turning him from a mindless pawn into his own man. Not wanting to waste a single second behind bars, he enrolled in rigorous correspondence courses offered through Queen's University to completely sharpen his mind. He even went out of his way to become a fully certified first aid responder, spending hours learning from the exhausted prison nurses exactly how to properly treat his fellow inmates whenever they suffered severe medical emergencies. The high-ranking correctional officials operating within both the United States and Canada glowingly described the former hockey star as the ultimate model prisoner, a guy who actively tutored struggling inmates and constantly worked to improve the living conditions on the inside. Finally, in March of 2009, after surviving 5 incredibly tough years at the Sandstone facility, Danton was officially packed up and transferred across the border to the Pittsburgh institution located in Joyceville, Ontario. Thanks to the specific rules of Canadian law, he had officially hit the milestone where he was completely eligible for early parole. Fast forward to September 11th, 2009. The National Parole Board officially granted him his full release back into society, but they slapped him with 2 massive conditions that basically summarize the entire tragic nature of his dark hockey story. He was strictly ordered to have absolutely 0 contact of any kind with his estranged father, Steve Jefferson, and he was completely banned from ever having any face-to-face meeting with his former puppet master, David Frost. When Mike first walked through those prison gates, he was a broken kid who literally could not function in normal society without Frost pulling his strings. But the man who walked out of those gates years later was someone else entirely, a fully independent survivor who had finally taken his life back. For the absolute first time since he was just a vulnerable 10-year-old kid lacing up his skates, Mike Danton was completely and utterly on his own when he took those first free steps out of the Pittsburgh institution in September of 2009. Now, before we get into the comeback story, I want to hear from you in the comments right now. Do you believe the justice system failed Mike Danton by punishing the victim while letting the real predator walk free? Drop your take below. This one genuinely sparks debate. Danton was a 28-year-old man armed with nothing more than a basic high school education, absolutely zero career prospects, barely a dime to his name, and a massive, ugly federal conviction permanently stained across his public record. Crashing on a couch in a buddy's Toronto condo, he later confessed that he was terrified, having absolutely no idea if anyone out in the real world would ever want him around for anything ever again. He was constantly agonizing over his dark past, wondering who in their right mind would ever want to actually befriend a convicted felon. He worried about who would ever want to marry him and build a life together, but then, completely out of the blue, his phone actually started ringing off the hook. Major Canadian universities were on the other end of the line, incredibly offering the disgraced player a massive second chance to lace up his skates, play competitive hockey, and actually earn a legitimate college degree. Among all the wild offers on the table, it was St. Mary's University out in Halifax that really stepped up to the plate and took the lead on bringing him back to the ice. St. Mary's athletic director Steve Sardi agonized over the choice, weighing the massive public relations risk against a fundamental moral question. His ultimate conclusion was profound. If a guy who paid his heavy dues to society gets a permanent red light, what exactly is the point of rehabilitation? So in January of 2010, Danton officially became a college student. Lacing up his skates for the Huskies varsity squad, he didn't miss a single beat, netting a wildly emotional goal during his very first shift back on the ice. By the time March rolled around, he helped power his underdog team past the formidable Alberta Golden Bears, capturing the 2010 University Cup and delivering the program its very first national title. But the real shocker was not his slick stick handling, it was his brain. He snagged academic all-Canadian honors, boasting a jaw-dropping 3.9 grade point average. Instead of taking the easy road through his coursework, he opted to tackle an intensely demanding double workload, diving headfirst into both psychology and criminology, two fields entirely inspired by the dark, twisted psychological manipulation he had survived throughout his youth. Reflecting on his wild journey, he openly admitted that he used to treat his elite athletic talent as an absolute entitlement, taking everything from the game to his own freedom completely for granted. Doing hard time forcefully rewired his entire perspective on life. After wrapping up his college career, the fierce drive to compete never faded, pushing him back into the professional circuit overseas. He evolved into the ultimate hockey journeyman, inking deals across Europe, dropping his bags in Swedish and Austrian locker rooms, grinding out rough shifts in Slovakia, Poland, and the rugged leagues of Kazakhstan. All the while, he was hitting the books, remotely refusing to let his education slip for a single second. Then came a truly unbelievable moment in Sweden. During his debut with a gritty Tier 3 club, his teammate Marcus Bengtsson absorbed a devastating open ice hit, violently crashing to the frozen surface and immediately going into terrifying, uncontrollable convulsions. Without a second of hesitation, the former professional enforcer threw himself onto the ice alongside the scrambling medics, staying remarkably calm under intense pressure as he waited for the seizing player's locked jaw to finally relax just enough to intervene, and expertly applied the emergency medical training he had picked up behind bars, clearing the man's blocked airway and preventing a horrifying death right there on the rink. It was the ultimate poetic irony, the life-saving techniques he mastered while serving time for a twisted murder-for-hire plot were the exact same tools he used to rescue a dying man. Fast forward to 2015, and he was standing at the altar exchanging vows with his longtime partner Nancy, eventually building a beautiful, quiet life together with their 2 kids. The following year, in 2016, he walked proudly across the stage at St. Mary's to collect his degree, officially graduating summa cum laude at the absolute top of his class. Putting his dark past entirely in the rearview mirror, he launched a grassroots development camp up in Halifax, Nova Scotia, pouring his heart into mentoring the next generation of rink rats with a strict, unwavering focus on mutual respect, personal accountability, and sound mental health. It was a coaching philosophy that stood as the exact polar opposite of the toxic, manipulative garbage he endured under David Frost. Speaking of the devil himself, despite all the horrific allegations, Frost miraculously walked out of a courtroom completely acquitted. He quietly surrendered his powerful credentials with the National Hockey League Players Association and practically vanished into thin air until eagle-eyed reporters busted him coaching kids out in Laguna Niguel, California, hiding cowardly behind the utterly fake alias of Jim McCauley. To this very day, the disgraced agent has not offered a single shred of genuine remorse or taken even an ounce of accountability for the shattered lives he left behind in his chaotic wake. Which brings us to the ultimate question at the heart of this bizarre saga: was throwing away 7.5 prime years of an athletic career over a botched assassination conspiracy actually worth the heavy toll? If you sat down and asked the man himself over a cup of coffee, he would not even blink before giving you a hard yes. Because spending those 5 brutal years locked inside a high-security federal penitentiary in Minnesota gifted him the one vital thing he never had since he was 10 years old: absolute freedom from a puppeteer pulling his strings. The broken, brainwashed teenager who was processed into that cell block literally could not tie his own shoes or make a single life choice without his abuser's strict permission. But the grown man who walked out of those iron gates was strong enough to literally breathe life back into a dying teammate using the very redemption he found behind bars. The harsh reality of incarceration was supposed to break him completely. Instead, being stripped of everything and thrown into a cage was the only medicine harsh enough to rip him away from his personal demon and truly set him free. If stories like this, the darkest, most insane corners of sports history, are your kind of content, then smash that like button, subscribe to the channel, and make sure you ring that notification bell so you never miss a single story. There are plenty more wild, unbelievable tales waiting to be unlaced. And trust me, you do not want to miss what is coming next.